The iron fence groaned in the wind, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the empty street. Mark stood at the threshold of the industrial district, his eyes fixed on the rusted facade of the factory. 3 years ago, this structure vibrated with the pulse of heavy machinery and constant movement. Now, it was a tomb of silent steel and shattered glass. He stepped forward, his boots crunching over debris that littered the cracked pavement. The gate hung off one hinge, swaying with a rhythmic, grating screech. He pushed it aside and walked into the cavernous main hall. Dust motes drifted in the stagnant shafts of light cutting through holes in the roof. The air smelled of damp earth and oxidized metal. He reached the center of the floor, the vast space stretching out in every direction. There were no lights, no voices, and no machines. Only the hollow echo of his own steady breathing. He looked down at the concrete, where oil stains had long since dried into dark, permanent maps of a vanished industry. He was standing in the center of his own wreckage. The silence was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed against his chest. He did not look for a way out. He simply looked at the space that once demanded everything he had, and now demanded nothing at all. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The market had not shifted overnight, but it felt that way. 1 week, the order books were full. The next, the demand vanished, replaced by a sudden, jagged silence. Trust me. He remembered the boardroom. His partners were pacing, their voices rising in pitch, fingers stabbing at spreadsheets that no longer made sense. They pointed at the economy, at global trends, at anything but their own lack of preparation. They were panicked, stripping the office of files and hardware, loading boxes into cars with frantic, clumsy movements. They did not wait for a plan. They did not look back. One by one, they walked away, leaving their chairs pushed back and their coffee mugs half finished on the desks. Mark had stood by the window, watching their vehicles pull out of the lot, one after another, until the concrete was empty. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than any noise. He turned back to the room. The air was thick with the dust of their hasty departure. He was the only one left in the building. The empire he had helped build had dissolved into a list of debts and a cavernous, empty floor. He realized then that their commitment had been tied to the profit, not the work itself. Mark remained in the center of the floor, his feet planted firmly on the cold, gray concrete. The sheer scale of the space seemed to amplify the silence. Above him, the steel rafters stretched into the gloom, holding nothing but shadows. He pivoted slowly, his gaze tracing the perimeter where rows of workbenches now sat barren. The lack of movement was absolute. He could hear the faint, rhythmic dripping of water from a leak somewhere in the far corner, a steady sound that measured the passage of his isolation. He felt the cold air moving through the broken windows, a sharp reminder of the environment he had allowed to slip into disrepair. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled, motionless. He did not pace. He did not look for a phone or a computer. He simply stood there, letting the magnitude of the collapse settle into his bones. Every shadow in the room represented a decision he had made, a resource he had mismanaged, or a market trend he had ignored. The weight of it was tangible, pressing against his shoulders like physical pressure. He stared at the center of the floor, breathing in the scent of stagnant air and old oil. The empire was gone. The noise was gone. Only the void remained, and for the first time, he did not turn away from it. The stillness finally broke. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The paper felt rough against his thumb, a stark contrast to the smooth, cold concrete beneath his boots. He opened it to the first clean page, the sound of the paper tearing slightly in the quiet air. He held his pen for a long moment, the tip hovering just above the white surface. He thought of the frantic calls, the desperate projections, and the hollow promises he had made to keep the business afloat. All of it was gone. He stopped wishing for the market to snap back to the way things were. He stopped waiting for the phone to ring with a miracle. He looked down at the empty page and pressed the pen firmly into the paper. He wrote one word in bold, deliberate strokes: reality. The ink bled slightly into the grain. As he capped the pen, the weight that had been pressing against his shoulders shifted. It was no longer a burden of failure, but a clean slate of facts. He stared at the word until the letters seemed to burn into his vision. The past was a ghost. The present was all that remained. He closed the book with a sharp snap that echoed off the high rafters, his eyes now scanning the room not as a wreckage of his legacy, but as a site for a new beginning. Mark tucked the notebook away and began to pace the length of the warehouse. He did not look for what was missing. He looked for what was still required by the world outside these walls. He knelt by a rusted machine, brushing away a layer of dust to check the serial number, then pulled a ledger from a shelf to cross-reference outdated output logs with current industry trends. He spent the next hour walking every aisle, his eyes tracking the flow of materials that had once moved through the loading docks. He stopped at the shipping bay, watching the traffic on the main road, noting the frequency of trucks and the types of components they carried. He wasn't looking for a return to his old contracts. He was hunting for a void in the current supply chain. He found it in the small, specialized parts that larger manufacturers ignored because they were too tedious to produce. He calculated the volume of demand on the back of his notebook, his pen moving in rapid rhythmic stabs. The desperation that had fueled his earlier mistakes vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. He saw the market not as a force to be feared, but as a puzzle of supply and demand waiting for a specific piece to be forged. He stood up, his legs stiff, and looked at the empty space with newfound clarity. He had the data. He knew exactly what the market needed. Mark emptied his personal account. The total was meager, a fraction of what he once managed in a single morning. He stared at the digital balance on his screen, then looked at the vacant floor of the factory. He could have used the money to settle lingering debts or to sustain his lifestyle for another few months of stagnation. Instead, he made his choice. He traveled to a specialized industrial auction house, ignoring the flashier equipment that promised speed without precision. He hunted for a specific high-precision lathe, a machine built for tolerances measured in microns. When he found it, the price was steep. It consumed almost every cent he had remaining. He did not hesitate. He swiped his card, the transaction feeling like the final severance from his old life. He arranged for the delivery, watching as the heavy crate was lifted off the truck and placed in the center of his warehouse floor. The wood creaked under the weight. It was a singular, heavy investment in his own capability. He stood back, watching the dust settle around the crate, knowing he had no safety net left. The gamble was absolute. He walked toward the machine, his hand resting on the cool, unpainted steel of the frame. He had traded his capital for a mechanism of production, and with that trade, he had finally crossed the point of no return. Mark stood alone in the silence. The factory was a cavern, and the lathe occupied only a fraction of it. He began the process of calibration, his movements deliberate and slow. He powered the machine on, and the motor hummed to life, a low-frequency vibration that traveled through the concrete floor and into his soles. He watched the carriage slide, tracking the movement of the cutting tool against the steel blank. At first, the sound was erratic, a series of uneven metallic chirps that signaled a lack of synchronization. He adjusted the feed rate, then the spindle speed, testing the tension of the drive belt. He did not look at the clock. He sat on a wooden crate, his gaze fixed on the point where metal met metal. He studied the curl of the shavings, the color of the heat tint, and the subtle pitch shift as the tool encountered resistance. Every cycle was a lesson. He stopped the machine, checked the tolerances with his calipers, and made a minute correction to the settings. He repeated this again and again, until the machine's rhythm became an extension of his own focus. The outside world faded. There was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the motor and the precise, predictable movement of the steel. He was no longer managing a business. He was learning the language of the metal itself. The shift from spectator to operator was marked by the changing texture of his skin. The palms of his hands grew thick, covered in patches of hardened, rough tissue that never quite softened. Metal filings became embedded in his pores, leaving tiny, dark traces that soap could not reach. He ignored the stinging of small lacerations caused by sharp steel edges, wrapping them in tape and continuing the work without a second thought. He no longer viewed the lathe as a machine to be studied. It was a partner to be commanded. His movements became fluid. He knew exactly when to apply pressure to the cutting tool and when to pull back, sensing the fatigue of the motor before the sensors even triggered a warning. He worked through the light of dawn and deep into the night, his mind clearing of old business anxieties. The constant, repetitive motion sharpened his instincts. He could feel the vibration of the spindle in his teeth, a grounding sensation that replaced the abstract stress of his former executive life. His confidence was no longer based on quarterly projections or market trends. It was built on the undeniable reality of the parts he produced, each one identical, each one precise. He was finally learning the weight of his own effort. The heavy steel door of the factory groaned as it shifted on its tracks. Mark did not look up immediately. His eyes locked on the lathe as a brass fitting reached its final tolerance. He tapped the stop switch, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. A man stood in the doorway, holding a crumpled schematic and a broken piece of machinery. It was a local supplier, someone Mark had known back when the factory was an empire. The man looked around the clean, sparse floor with obvious confusion. He walked toward the workbench, his boots echoing against the concrete. He laid the broken part down and pointed to a complex, threaded housing that had sheared in half. The supplier spoke, his voice thin in the vast space. He had been turned away by 3 other shops in the district. They claimed the tolerance was too tight, the geometry impossible to replicate without custom tooling. Mark picked up the part. He felt the weight, the angle of the fracture, and the specific density of the alloy. He did not ask about the price or the timeline. He looked at the supplier, then back at the lathe, and felt the first true spark of purpose since the collapse. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and pulled his notebook from his pocket to begin the calculations. The process began with the smell of cutting fluid and the hum of the machine as it bit into the raw steel. Mark worked in a state of absolute focus, his eyes tracking the toolpath with surgical precision. Midway through the first run, the lathe vibrated in a way that felt wrong. He hit the emergency stop, inspected the housing, and found a microscopic deviation in the alignment. He did not curse or hesitate. He stripped the setup, recalibrated every axis, and began again from the first cut. Hours passed in the dim light of the factory. When the final thread was chased, he removed the prototype and polished it until the surface reflected the overhead lights without a single blemish. He wiped the lathe clean, placed the part in a simple cardboard box, and walked to the supplier's office. He reached the counter just as the man was preparing to close. Mark placed the box down, slid it forward, and waited. The supplier opened it, took a set of calipers from his pocket, and checked the measurements one by one. The man looked up, his eyes searching Mark for some sign of pride or expectation. Mark said nothing. He simply nodded, turned around, and walked back into the night, leaving the quality of the steel to speak for itself. 2 days later, the supplier returned, but this time he did not come alone. He brought a crate of raw materials and a contract for 50 units. The man paced the floor, talking about market gaps and the sudden inability of competitors to keep up with the demand. He was agitated, energetic, and clearly expected Mark to be ecstatic. Mark stood still. He listened to the pitch, watched the man gesture at the empty corners of the factory, and felt the distinct pull of a potential empire. The opportunity was real, and the profit was immediate. Mark looked at his notebook, then at the single lathe that had become the anchor of his life. He felt the first surge of success, a sharp, cold clarity that tasted like metal. He did not smile or offer a handshake immediately. He asked for the specifications of the new order, verified the raw material quality, and checked his production timeline. He saw the rush in the supplier's eyes, the demand for speed, and the pressure to hire and expand. Mark took a slow breath, grounding his feet on the concrete. He accepted the order, but he did not accept the urgency. He would keep his process, his pace, and his focus. He had built this on discipline, and he would not trade that foundation for a larger, noisier factory floor. The supplier left, and the silence returned to the factory, heavy with the weight of the new contract. 50 units. It was a mountain of work for one man and one machine. By noon, a local recruiter knocked on the steel door, offering to source skilled hands, but Mark shook his head and closed the gate. He did not need a team. He needed control. He pulled a chair to the workbench and mapped out a schedule that accounted for every hour of the day. He broke the 50 units into 10 smaller batches, ensuring that each one would receive the same scrutiny as the first prototype. He cleared the floor of everything that did not serve the immediate task, creating a narrow, efficient lane from the raw materials to the lathe. He worked in blocks of 4 hours, followed by a set period of maintenance to keep the machine running true. The supplier called twice that evening, asking for a progress update and pushing for a delivery date that was physically impossible to hit without cutting corners. Mark answered each call with facts, not promises. He logged the hours, tracked the output, and refused to deviate from his established process. He remained the only hand on the controls, turning the machine with a steady, calculated pace that resisted the frantic energy of the market outside. Mark did not stop at the production line. He turned his attention to the perimeter of the factory, where years of accumulated waste sat gathering dust. He found pallets of unused components, leftovers from his previous empire, and had them hauled to the scrapyard. He canceled recurring utility contracts for zones he no longer occupied, cutting his overhead to the bone. Every cent saved was a cent that reinforced his independence. He dismantled the old office partition, reclaiming the floor space to streamline his workflow. Where his partners once obsessed over floor-to-ceiling displays and excessive administrative staff, Mark now prioritized raw utility. He replaced the expensive, leased inventory management software with a simple, manual logbook that tracked every movement of material in real time. The factory was not just quiet, it was surgically precise. He removed the excess, the ornamental, and the unnecessary until the business functioned as a single, lean organism. He watched the light move across the empty, clean concrete, noting how much faster he could maneuver without the clutter of his past. He was building a fortress of efficiency, stripping away the layers of vanity that had once made his company vulnerable. By the time he finished, the factory floor was a stark, functional mirror of his own discipline. He had traded the bloated, fragile success of his past for a compact, unbreakable reality. The rhythm of the shop was absolute. Every morning, the lathe started at dawn, and every evening, it stopped only when the daily quota was met. Mark was not looking for attention, but success has a way of broadcasting its own signal. In the industrial district, where silence had once been the rule, whispers began to circulate. Suppliers who had previously ignored his calls were now checking on his capacity. The news of his consistent output, his lean overhead, and his ability to land custom contracts reached beyond the walls of his factory. It filtered through the city, eventually landing in the ears of those who had once walked away. Mark did not hear the phone rings or see the emails, but he felt the shift in the air. The atmosphere outside the factory gate grew heavy. He noticed unfamiliar cars idling at the street corner, their occupants watching the loading dock through tinted glass. It was not a direct confrontation, but a slow, encroaching pressure. He continued his work. Ignoring the eyes that tracked his progress from the shadows of the street, he knew the pattern. The vultures had caught the scent of a stable harvest. He locked the main gate, checked his inventory levels, and prepared for the inevitable knock on the steel door. The past was no longer buried. It was standing on his doorstep, watching him work. The heavy steel door groaned as Mark pulled it open. 3 men stood on the threshold, their posture radiating the same confidence that had once led them to ruin. They did not wait for an invitation. Stepping into the threshold with practiced ease, one of them gestured toward the humming machines, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We heard you found a rhythm, Mark. Let us help you scale this. We have the capital to turn this shop into what it should have been years ago." Mark did not step aside to let them pass. He remained fixed in the doorway, his hand gripping the cold metal frame. They laid out a contract, detailing a massive buy-in that would return them to positions of power. They spoke of markets and expansion, their words echoing with the same hollow optimism that had caused the factory to collapse 3 years prior. Mark watched them, noting how they ignored the precision of the equipment and the organization of the floor. They saw only a commodity to be exploited, not a business to be built. He felt the cold air of the street behind them pressing against the warmth of his workshop. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of their collective failure. He looked at their hands, outstretched with the promise of capital, and saw only the ghost of the disaster they had once walked away from. Mark did not answer them immediately. He turned his back to the men and walked deep into the factory floor. The sound of the machines enveloped him, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that felt like a heartbeat. He closed his eyes. In the sudden darkness, he saw the floor as it had been 3 years ago. Empty, cold. He remembered the specific sensation of the silence, then a heavy, suffocating pressure that made his chest ache. He recalled the nights he sat on the concrete, staring at a blank notebook, unsure if he would even have electricity the following week. He remembered the failures that had stripped away his ego, the moments where he had lost everything and found only the raw, unvarnished truth of his own limitations. Those were not just setbacks. They were the forge. Every mistake he had made in those 3 years had been a lesson in survival. He opened his eyes, looking at the organized inventory and the precision tools currently humming with life. The contrast was absolute. He had built this from the wreckage of his own desperation. His former partners were still standing by the door, waiting for a nod, but they were looking at a version of him that no longer existed. He felt the weight of those past nights anchoring him to the spot, making his decision not just an act of business, but an act of survival. Mark walked back across the floor, his boots striking the concrete with a steady, rhythmic cadence. He reached the group and extended his hand. The contact was brief, firm, and entirely devoid of the warmth they were searching for. He pulled his hand back and looked each of them in the eye. "I appreciate the offer," he said, his voice level and devoid of hesitation. "But this business is no longer a collective effort. It is the result of 3 years of absolute, solitary focus." One of them started to interject, gesturing toward the expansion plans, but Mark held up a hand to stop him. He did not need to explain the hours of trial and error or the nights he had spent mastering the lathe. The evidence was in the hum of the machines and the precision of the parts stacked on the tables. "Your capital is not the foundation I need," Mark continued. "I have built this on a different currency: discipline. I am not interested in scaling up for the sake of growth. I am interested in maintaining the integrity of the process." He watched their faces shift from expectant confidence to confused realization. They were looking for a partner to exploit, but they had found an architect who was not for sale. He nodded once, a final signal that the conversation was over. As they turned toward the door, Mark did not watch them leave. He walked back to his workbench and picked up his tools. The heavy industrial door clicked shut behind them, sealing the factory in a sudden, absolute stillness. Mark remained standing exactly where he had ended the conversation. He did not feel relief or triumph. He felt a profound, quiet clarity. He looked at the vast expanse of the floor. 3 years ago, this space had been a graveyard of his ambitions. Now, it was a living, breathing testament to his own persistence. He walked to the center of the floor and listened. The faint vibration of the cooling machines against the concrete was the only sound. It was the sound of a system operating exactly as he had designed it. He realized then that the partners had been chasing a ghost, the version of him that needed their validation to exist. They could not see the empire he had built because it was not made of capital or market share. It was made of the thousands of tiny, disciplined choices he had made when no one was watching. He walked to his workbench and ran his palm over the cold, metal surface of the lathe. His hands were steady. His breathing was rhythmic. The doubt that had once paralyzed him had been replaced by the absolute certainty of his own capability. He had not just saved a business, he had rewired his own life. The empire was not the building. The empire was the man who could stand in the silence and know exactly what to do next. Mark leaned into the workbench, his shadow long against the floor. He ignored the silence beyond the walls. He focused entirely on the steel frame of the lathe. His fingers traced the edge of the micrometer, feeling for the slightest deviation in the calibration. He found a fraction of a millimeter off-center and adjusted the tensioning screw. The metal clicked into place. He did not rush the movement. He treated the adjustment as a fundamental necessity, a simple correction in a complex system. Outside, the market might fluctuate, prices might spike, and competitors might scramble for advantage. But here, the variables were under his control. He tightened the locking nut and wiped the oil from his palms. The air in the factory felt static, cleared of the noise of past failures and the frantic pace of external influence. Luck was a variable he had long ago removed from his calculations. He shifted his grip on the wrench, checked the spindle speed, and set the depth gauge. His eyes remained fixed on the contact point of the cutting head. He was not waiting for an opportunity. He was creating the conditions for it to manifest. His movements were precise, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He had mastered the machine, and in doing so, he had mastered the impulse to seek validation elsewhere. The work ahead was all that mattered. Mark engaged the power switch. The deep, low hum of the drive motor vibrated through the concrete floor, rising steadily to a consistent pitch. He watched the indicator lights pulse in time with the machine. He moved to the secondary stations, flipping levers and checking fluid levels with a fluid, practiced sequence of motions. Across the room, the automated conveyor clicked into life, shifting the first raw materials toward the cutting zone. He did not look at the clock. He did not look at the city skyline beyond the windows. He watched the material feed into the lathe. The metal shavings curled away in perfect, repetitive spirals, falling into the collection bin with a rhythmic metallic ping. Every action was a deliberate piece of a larger, self-sustaining architecture. He moved between the stations, adjusting pressure, monitoring the output, and ensuring the flow remained uninterrupted. The factory was no longer a hollow shell of past failures. It was a calibrated instrument. He felt the vibration of the floor through the soles of his boots, a steady, pulsing reminder of the system he had built from scratch. He stepped back and observed the cycle. The machines ran without hesitation. He picked up his notebook, recorded the final calibration for the evening, and set it down. He was the architect. The work was constant. The outcome was his own.